Welcome to Wealth Well Done. Together, we'll cover a wide range of important topics surrounding money and the impact it has on our lives. From the sophisticated and highly valuable planning techniques of the ultra-wealthy to the commonly underutilized biblical teachings. Together, we'll work to improve our relationship with money and our effectiveness in stewarding it well. Here's your host, Eric Scovill.
All right. Welcome to the 67th episode of the Well Done podcast, where we are examining tactical, practical, and biblical ways to help you steward your wealth well done. Last week, we had on Isaac Schaefer, and I do apologize for the audio quality issue that we had. For some reason, we weren't able to record, or the audio wasn't captured through our normal microphones here, and we actually had to decide to just use the backup camera audio, which was certainly not our normal quality, but apologize for that. The content of the discussion seemed too good to try to replicate that or lose that. So either way, hopefully the audio is working this week here, but we are happy to have Tom Costello back on. Tom, if you will remember, was on very early with this, maybe around May or June of last year, Tom, that you were on.
Yeah, something along those lines. A little over a year ago.
Thank you for joining us again here.
Absolutely pleasure.
So looking forward to some of the content that we've got teed up for today. Tom is a business partner of mine in our hedge fund, and Tom is a incredible wealth of information when it comes to world economics, understanding how all these different factors tie into our daily lives, into our account balances, what is happening behind the scenes in a lot of ways. Not that he's got that this is going to be your answer to everything economical, and all the right moves to make in your market portfolio, but we're intending to give you a different perspective from an institutional mind into how the world of finance is working and what you're seeing at play right now. So we'll make sure we get that disclaimer in here that none of this is intended to be financial advice for you. This is meant to be educational, to help you build out your own understanding of what's going on in the world. But we certainly want you to talk to your financial team about how any of this may actually apply to you. That said, Tom, there's a lot going on in the world right now.
I don't know what you
mean. Yeah. So Tom is sitting
one assassination attempt. There's two assassination attempts technically. One forced plane landing, one resignation from the election because of medical issues which don't apply to the presidency because nobody's resigned from that. Right. It's just there's this old joke, right? They say some years there's only a week's worth of news, and some weeks there's years worth of news. And the last 4 weeks has definitely been overload.
A year's worth of news, no doubt. And yeah, so as we look at finances, and obviously now as a financial advisor, we're hearing people talk about, hey, what impact is the election going to have on the market? And I remember, last election, people were saying, listen, I want to pull out of the market because if Biden gets elected, then the market's going to tank because everyone knows that if Biden gets in, then the whole economy is going to crash. And so I had people pull out of the market, and then Biden gets elected and they're sitting there ready, white knuckled, ready to watch the economy crash, and, the market jumps up. And so there's all of these different, I think a lot of ways we create different fallacies around what's going to move the market. But you, with your institutional background, I think you see things differently. I know you see things differently than the everyday investor. And so I don't know that a lot of institutional investors are listening to this podcast. I think we have a lot more of individuals, and what you would call a retail investor. So will you help a retail investor understand something like what impact is a presidential nomination the election likely to have on the market?
Yeah, it's not a small thing. Generally speaking, the U.S. government, the federal government, has been mismanaged by both Democrats and Republicans. Neither has has said, hey, let's try to employ a little bit of virtue in how we actually manage spending and manage taxation. And none of those things were important to either party. With that said, those people who looked at Joe Biden in the last election and said, this man is as incompetent person for this role, as economically incompetent a person for this role as ever run. That's absolutely true. Joe Biden he has absolutely no idea how an economy works. He's never had a private sector job. He's only ever been a guy who says things on TV for a living. That has been his job for 50 years.
Sure.
Kamala Harris, very, very similar. No idea how an economy works. The people under her don't have any idea how an economy works, but they know it's popular. They know that if you spend a bunch of money, that's popular. Why? Well, it may cause inflation, but inflation does cause the market to rise in many cases. Depends on, where that inflation is coming from and how. There's a little bit of nuance there. But generally speaking, U.S. equities one way you can value them is as a representation of the store of value of the assets held by that company. So as the assets of those companies rise in value because of inflation, those stocks also rise. That isn't universal, and it's different for some industries than others, but that has been a big component over the last 4 years of what's been pushing the stock market higher. It's been this wildfire spending program, trillions and trillions of borrowed dollars being spent now that really should have been spent from taxes collected decades from now. So, yeah, it's definitely a tricky thing. A presidential race doesn't generally have, like, the individual personality of Kamala Harris and the individual personality of Donald Trump are not going to have a big impact on it. Generally, but this no taxes on tips is a great example. So a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump said, you know what, let's not charge any taxes on tips. Those are, generally speaking, working class people. We want to help them. Let's just not charge them taxes on their tips. We'll give up a little bit of revenue, but it'll help people that we want to help. Well, yesterday, Kamala Harris adopted that program too. Hey, no new taxes on tips. We're going to do that too, she says. So in Trump's case, when he says it, I think you would rightly interpret that as an indication that he's going to look for ways for the government to take less money out of the economy and to leave it in private sector hands so that it can be spent more efficiently. Whereas in Kamala's case, she just spent the last 4 years arming the IRS to take more money from tips. So in her case, it's purely a matter of political expediency. She wants to do it because it'll get her another, 0.25% of votes in Nevada, right? So
Right.
In her case, it doesn't indicate any change in perspective. She believes the government should be making all the decisions in the economy and spending all the money because it's really theirs. They're allowing you to keep some of it. Whereas Donald Trump is expressing a perspective that's different than that. He thinks the money should remain in the private sector if at all possible, and he'd rather scale back the amount of decision-making the government has in the economy. So those two things lead in two very, very different directions. Will Donald Trump be able to do that, or Kamala Harris be able to do what she wants? Odds are probably no. Neither one of them are, neither one of them are stupendous leaders, in my opinion, right? I think we could probably find somebody who would be better at the job than either of them. But
Sure.
with that said, if you have to pick one or the other, generally speaking, it will be better and healthier for the economy in the long run if the private sector makes more decisions. Government is the least efficient way for any economy to spend money.
Okay, thank you for that. If the private sector is making more decisions, I guess where my head goes is we've been talking so much about, and not we as in you and I, but just economists and other people have been talking so much about the need for a recession, the need for a real recession, the need to bring valuations inside the stock market back down. And there are stats upon stats upon stats that say, we are higher than we have ever been before in terms of valuations. If you pick some baseline to measure them against, and so is a healthier economy one that that has a 20 or 30% correction and then proceeds on from there? Is that healthier? Or
So yeah, I have an opinion on that that differs in many ways from my peers. I think a lot of the spending that you have at the tail end of a boom cycle is irresponsible. It's money spent on things that sound like a good idea. Maybe they'll be a good idea, but probably won't be a good idea. And then that'll just be money wasted, which adds to inflation. I think a recession, making things hard again, where it isn't quite so easy to get by in the world while making bad decisions, is a great thing to put a culture back on track. So the society suddenly becomes a little bit more virtuous because they see that of being virtuous has more of a bonus for it, as opposed to, going into the porn business or whatever, right? Something horrible. Sure. That may make you money, but it's going to collapse as soon as people have to spend money on food, right? So in terms of what's healthy for the economy, you have to think about short-term and long-term. It's pretty clear we're going to have some sort of slowdown. I think the higher interest rates are definitely pushing it that way. Whether it's going to be a perfect soft landing is what many people have been talking about, or it's going to be something a little harder with slightly higher unemployment. I don't think that's going to matter much because the Fed has tools to respond to it. They're effective. They know how to use them. They are not too irresponsible about them, and they'll get it turned around pretty quickly. Low unemployment is part of their mandate. So should we be striving for a recession? Well, no, not you. It's never a goal, right? You always want to have, 1.5%, 2% inflation. You always want to have low, slow growth in an economy. You can even get away with more than that in the right set of circumstances. The question is it economic growth that is really going to benefit over a slightly longer term than, one presidential cycle? A 4-year cycle is not very long when it comes to economic statistics.
Right. Okay. Let's back up a little bit on the Fed.
Sure.
I think that is a highly misunderstood organization. Their power, their tools, their effectiveness. Can you give us some color into? Let's maybe do this in 2 layers. One, who the Fed is in general, and then second, let's go into some of the tools and the ways that they can somewhat manufacture the getting us back to where they want us to be.
Sure. So the Federal Reserve is a pseudo-private institution. It's a series of banks across the country. There's a Federal Reserve Board who each of the heads of each of these banks get together and they make decisions about interest rates and a couple other industry statistics. They also run a lender of last resort program for the banks, which is important during moments of crisis, and a couple other things that they're involved in. They are not part of the government. The Federal Reserve chairman is appointed by the president, or is nominated by the president and then chosen by the board, but they are not government employees. They're private employees, and this is a private institution. Its sole charter is 2 parts: keeping unemployment low and keeping growth positive. Right, so they want to keep inflation under control and keep unemployment low. And to do that in the light of keeping the economy growing. They don't want deflation under any circumstances. They want a small amount of inflation every year, something that won't get out of control, something that doesn't necessarily hurt people, is slow enough so that the economy can respond to it cogently. The tools that they typically use for managing inflation and managing growth in the economy is interest rates. So they will set a target rate, and the banks will generally respond to that because it's a rate at which they can borrow, right? The AAA banks can all borrow at the prime lending rate. So, if you're JP Morgan and you're going to lend money, say, to our hedge fund, and you want to make 200 basis points on the money that they lend to us. If you can borrow it at 4%, you're going to lend it to us at 6%. Right? So now we can borrow money at 6%. That means we can make investments that maybe only yield 10%. But if interest rates go up to 7 or 8%, they still want to make their 200 basis points. Now they're lending to us at 9. We have to think much more carefully about a 10% yielding investment. So that's how the economy is sort of the gas pedal and the brake are the same pedal, right? It's interest rates up and interest rates down. And generally speaking, it works pretty well. There's some nuance there. The Fed has always been subject to something called jawboning. So Federal Reserve Chairman works in D.C. He's surrounded at all times by politicians. He's talking to politicians. He gets a great deal of political pressure to raise or lower interest rates at any given moment. So the politicians can say, see, I got you low interest rates. See, I got you your unemployment down. See, I'm great. I did this thing, right? But really, it's the Federal Reserve who's doing all those things. A lot of people don't like the Federal Reserve for deep philosophical reasons. Maybe they're a little bit more libertarian. Maybe they look at the long history of the Fed, and the Fed has, generally speaking, fiat currencies, which is a currency that has no nominal value, no hard asset value. It's just a good faith and credit currency. A fiat currency is easily manipulated and easily maneuvered by a bank. And if you impugn some negative intention to the Federal Reserve, it's easy to see how that would lead to unwanted consequences for most people. In point of fact, I don't think the Fed's done a terrible job up to now. There, with some nuance on that, there are certain things about the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates unemployment, which I think have degraded over time and gotten worse. There are things having to do with, some of the emergency lending facilities that the banks use. The Federal Reserve participation in the 2008 mortgage bond debacle, I take great exception to how that was handled. But generally speaking, they've done okay, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think this, if you're going to empower me as emperor of the universe, the Federal Reserve is not the first place I'm going to look to fix things.
Good perspective. Thank you. Okay. For inside the Federal Reserve here, and it's something that we've talked about before, where whether we're calling this the Fed or the U.S. government here is, a rock in between a rock and a hard place with what do they do? That they're in a lose situation. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And it's been a while since we've talked about that, and we can use some current color into where we're at today.
So broadly speaking, there's two institutions that have that are in a bad situation. The first is the U.S. Treasury, which issues government debt. So politicians go and spend the money. They have a budget or don't have a budget, as they haven't had for many, many years now. They just look at how much money they think they need to spend and borrow it. From the amount that they have the amount they want to spend, they have the amount they collect in taxes every year, and then they borrow the rest. So every year they have to borrow more. They still have to pay interest on last year's debt, so they need to borrow even more this year, so on and so on and so on. So the debt goes higher and higher. But the people that are making mistakes are the politicians who are spending money. They're spending money from 40 years from now already, right? Our grandchildren's taxes will be paying for the debt that they're already issuing. So that's a problem. The Federal Reserve tries to manage short-term liabilities. They try and manage short-term interest rates, which is the tool they use to turn on the gas or the brake for the economy. And generally speaking, they let the rest of the interest rate curve manage itself under most circumstances. But the problem is the Treasury has spent so much money, and that if the Federal Reserve allows interest rates to rise normally, it will cost so much money to fund the government's current debt that the economy will collapse. Right. So they need to keep the interest rate low. But when they do that, they also raise the risk of inflation. So they're caught between inflation on one side and a collapsing U.S. government on the other. It's taken my entire life. I'm 60 years old. It's taken 50 years to get into this really dire situation where they say there's much ruin in a nation, right? Is an old line. This is a circumstance that cannot possibly continue. Everybody knows it can't continue. It also can't be fixed, is the problem. So the politicians who generally have a short-term view say, well, let's just push it off till tomorrow and see if we get an idea that'll lead us to fixing it. In the end, we're either going to get more inflation, we're going to get selective default, or we're going to get both. Because the government doesn't have any incentive to spend less money. The people the voters don't want them to spend less money. They want them to spend more money. Everybody wants free money, right?
Sure.
So they want the government to stop giving money to everybody else. They want their own thing to keep going. They just don't want anybody else to get any money, right? So everybody wants something turned off, but politicians can't do that. So because the voters can't figure this out, because we have become, largely speaking, in terms of our government, unvirtuous people, our government is not being run in a virtuous way. The money's being spent. There's really no getting out of it. One thing that Donald Trump has said that I find encouraging, because it opens up a new dimension of possibility, is he has said that on the day he gets elected, assuming he gets elected, there's by no means a safe assumption. On the day he gets elected, he's going to close the Department of Education. Department of Education is about 4,000 employees, maybe more. My memory fails. Senior moment. I think it's about 4,000 employees. It's the smallest of the departments, and a couple of $1 trillion in budget or whatever it is. So he's planning on just eliminating the whole thing, just pulling the plug. I think that bodes very well, because not only will that be spending for the HR department of the United States, that just won't happen anymore. A lot of that money is just being wasted. What he should really do is do that across the board, where I'm sure there's a lot of other departments where radical reduction in staff would actually improve things. But and here's the other thing: you have to think about short-term versus long-term. When he does that, that's a lot of money that is not going into the economy that was. So that will immediately cause an economic contraction, instantly. Will it be a good one? You have to let things play out. You have to see. Over the long term, maybe it will be, because it's going to lower the overall debt as well. But will it be enough? Odds are probably no.
So I'm looking right now at the U.S. debt clock, and I don't know how accurate this actually is here, but what it says right now is that the federal tax revenue is just a hair under $5 trillion.
Yeah, that sounds right.
The U.S. total interest paid on our $35 trillion of debt is just under $4.7 trillion.
Right. And if interest rates rise 1%, it bumps up over taxes collected.
Right.
So now we're spiraling, right?
So with spending at 6 point, go ahead.
Well, off camera, right before we got started, we were talking a little bit about Japan. You want to see the future for America? Look at Japan. Japan is done. They were years ahead of us. They're further along. Their population was declining faster than ours. They have not imported 55 million illegal aliens. They have a declining population, a rapidly aging population, and their economy has zombie corporations and also all sorts of problems that they simply don't want to address for a variety of cultural reasons. Just this, in recent weeks, there was a big market perturbation a couple of weeks ago because the Japanese were forced to keep interest rates really low. They had no choice, right?
Sure.
They kept interest rates low because their government would go bankrupt if they didn't. So people in the hedge fund industry had been going and borrowing money in Japan where it was cheap to borrow and investing it elsewhere in the world. So I think it was 2 weeks ago, the head of the Japanese central bank said, we're going to have to raise interest rates because their currency was falling so rapidly. Japan's in a weird spot. They have to import everything, energy, everything. They have no natural resources there. So if they raise interest rates, that helps their importers because it raises the value of their currency. But all the people that have borrowed money there and doing other investments, that raises their interest rate as well. It's called a carry trade, right? So all the hedge funds sold back their yen, sold all the assets they were holding all over the world that they had borrowed yen to buy, gave back their yen loans out of fear that the Japanese central bank was going to raise rates. And then as soon as that happened, the Japanese politicians got their hands on the head of the central bank and said, "You raise rates, you're going to kill the government." So they came a week later. They said, "Hi, we can't raise rates. We've decided we're going to wait, see what happens." So they're literally in the rock and between the same rock and hard place that we are. They're just years ahead.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that they're going to collapse before we are. There's really no assurance that that's the case. There has been occasion over the last few years to talk about hyperinflation. There's a difference between inflation and hyperinflation. Inflation is an economic phenomenon where there's money is growing faster than the stuff that it's used to buy. Inflation can be very high. Brazil has had 100% inflation without it being hyperinflation. It's just a natural consequence of irresponsible government and irresponsible management of the currency. Hyperinflation is when confidence in the political institutions collapses and you no longer believe that the country is going to be able to come up with a rational solution to the economic box it's found itself in. So you've seen hyperinflation in Africa on a number of occasions. Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe was the best example. And that's because he had decided that printing more money was going to be the answer to every single problem that the government had. And that's not a rational thinking, right? Because that was the case, that whole thing just collapsed. My daughter has a $100 trillion bill from Zimbabwe hanging on her wall that I gave her when she was in high school.
Worth about zero.
I don't think it has any value at all.
Yeah.
I think, some 100,000th of a cent, I think.
So to look at this, the U.S. federal spending, there's a difference between the official and the actual. The official is 6.8, a little under 6.7, or should be 6.9 trillion. The actual is a little bit over 7 trillion. And so even if we cut, if we cut 70% of the spending that the government does, we're just covering the interest on our debt.
And to do that would cause a global economic collapse.
Right.
So you have to think of this as a
simple solution is.
You have to think of this as one of those Mad Max tractor trailers that they use in Australia that has like 5 trailers back to back, except it's going down a hill in the Rocky Mountains. You can slow it down. But you got to do it very gingerly and very carefully, right? And you can't let it go too fast because then you can't ever slow it down.
Right.
But slamming on the brakes, that's completely out of the question. What you're envisioning is a slamming on the brakes, and that would cause cannibalism in Eastern Europe in 6 weeks. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, you start thinking about the amount of aid that's going around the world here from the U.S. too.
Well, forget aid. The imports into Germany support, companies in Turkey and the entire global supply. It'd be like COVID, only with no check from the government. The entire global economy would collapse. So there are things we can do. We can cut spending. And here's the real problem. The money that, and you and I have spoken about this in the past, the money that you spent, when you go and spend $1, you're careful to get good quality. You are careful to spend money where you get the most for it, right? So you're going to spend $25 to buy a steak. You're going to go to the place that sells steak for the cheapest per pound, and you're going to look around and make sure you get the best cut, right? Because you're spending your money, and you want to make sure you get as much value for that as you can. When the government spends money, it's not their money. They don't care how much they spend. They're buying it from whatever, the easiest place. And if that's the most expensive, so be it. Good cut, they don't care. They're not going to eat it. They're buying it for somebody else. So they don't care if it's a good cut. So they'll spend the same dollar that you will, but they'll get poorer quality and they'll get less of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And generally speaking, the money that government spends, the government put together this inflation fighting bill. It was really just a Green New Deal bill that increased inflation. But they took that money and they spent it. Generally speaking, the amount of stuff they get in the open market for that dollar of spending is going to be less than $1. They will get 50%, 50 cents of stuff for the dollar, so 50 cents of it would go toward inflation. In some cases, extreme cases like the Inflation Reduction Act, it's probably more like 10%. You've heard stories, I'm sure, they were building these electric charging stations. They spent $1 trillion on it, and they got 8 electric charging stations. And, there's horrible stories like that all throughout government. So that means all that extra money, all of that is being consumed by someone. That's just inflation.
And so what we had talked about, I want to maybe switch out of this here. Sure. What we had talked about was the idea that the inflation that was happening and the changes to the way that the inflation was being measured. It seemed to me to be something that inflation is probably the best of the rock and the hard place here. With the choices that they have, inflation is a better choice for the government. And even better yet is if they can tell people that inflation is not as bad as what it actually is, and they can avoid people reacting, avoid people panicking in a sense here. And so pretending that, changing the way that we measure inflation allows us to manipulate that down and tell people it's not as bad as what it actually is. It allows us to, give less increase to Social Security and all sorts of other things too. But we really need inflation to continue going, and we just don't want people to know about it. That's be the healthiest thing for the United States.
Certainly the government will, in the end, prefer high inflation because they can use those lower value dollars to pay off interest or to borrow more money. I mean, they can continue to do what they've been doing all this time. And I think it's pretty safe to assume that where possible, people in government are going to be dishonest with you. They're not going to tell you the whole story. They're not going to tell it to you clearly. They're going to spin it carefully so that you don't think it's as bad as it really is. The problem is, you still have to go to the supermarket, right? You still know, that steak doesn't cost $25 anymore. It costs $50.
Right.
You can't hide that.
Right.
But like I said, there's much ruin in the nation. We have even now, we have a very, very high living standard in the U.S. If we were I did a study many, many years ago, right after the 2008 mortgage bond crisis. If we were going to devalue our debt to zero at that point, I worked through the math, and it would involve lowering the living standard in the U.S. down to the level that Poland was at the time. So that's dramatic. That would mean a big, horrifying reduction in living standard, but it wouldn't be Mad Max and the Thunderdome. You know what I mean? And that was the kind of thing I was hearing from people immediately after 2008 is, I better stock up on ammunition, that kind of. And I'm like, look, it's bad. It's not great. No need to panic. And even now, I think there's still no need to panic. The fact that this is, I still believe it's now gone beyond the point where it can be reasonably solved. I think we're going to get something that we don't like, and it'll be over a period of time, and that'll inevitably lead to something else. But with that said, I don't believe it's going to get there quickly, and I don't believe it's going to get there all at once. And if Donald Trump gets elected and starts taking a chainsaw to huge sections of the federal government, that could change the equation dramatically. You think about it, 4,000 employees, maybe he saves, 20 or $30 billion in the single year's budget. Well, you discount that forward for the next 50 years that those people don't work for the U.S. government anymore. All their efforts and all the people that come after them won't be there either. So when you discount it, it starts to have a really big impact.
Right.
That sort of thing I find encouraging.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the last thought here, is there Is there a way out of this that happens in our lifetime without some brutal world war where we go to every non-U.S. debt holder and we just decide, hey, we don't owe you anything anymore?
I hope not. So I'm 60. You're in your 40s. 40. In my lifetime, realistically, is the next 30 years. It's not a lot of time. I could live longer than that. I'm very, very healthy. I'm the healthiest guy I know. I don't even have reading glasses. But actuarial tables are actuarial tables. I don't want something that solves it in 30 years. I'd be content if it looked like it was heading in the right direction, right? Still looked like a horrible problem that's going to be a terrible thing one day. But at least instead of deviating like this, it went like this and then maybe flattened out a little or maybe even dipped a little. It's still a big problem because the nominal gap is huge. But if I saw something like that, I'd be overjoyed. You have a little bit more time than me. If I see that, well, maybe it might be even better for you.
Right.
The trick and the real trick, I believe, and I'm hesitant to say this, but the real problem is not our government. It's not the economy. It's not the Federal Reserve. The real problem is us.
Yeah.
We are not acting in a virtuous manner. We have drifted away from God. If we take our commitment to God more seriously in all aspects of our life, including how we relate to the government, and we compel those in government to respond in a like manner, things will improve. They will. We'll find that golden path between the horrible minefield over here and the dangerous forest full of predators over there. That's what I truly believe is the real answer to this. How, you know me,
Yeah.
my life has been filled with sin from one end to the other. I'm certainly not the right guy to ask how to solve that problem, how to get America back on that track. But I think it's the right thing to do. I think that's the thing that will help us, if you want to know the truth. And we're talking about very long time frames, right? So
yeah,
there's time.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I don't see, because obviously a war like that doesn't even solve. If we just got rid of all of the non-U.S. debt holders, that doesn't fix the problem either, not even close. So I
don't cherry on top.
It helped, but right, I don't see any path out of this that isn't a divine intervention. So
in a war, wars generally are inflationary. Think about that. You spend a couple of $1 billion on bombs and planes, and then you go and blow them up. So you get nothing for it, right?
Right.
Wars are extremely inflationary, which is good for the economy. World War II got the economy going like crazy. But then you don't have anything for it, right?
Right.
That doesn't solve the debt problem. Selective default won't cause a war. Even the Chinese know they can't win a hot war against us. So I don't think anybody's really interested in it. Everybody's interested in talking about it and threatening it, but nobody's really interested in doing it.
Yeah.
So, except, some of the people in D.C., they apparently like being at war. Some of them. So I don't think that's the kind of thing that gets us out of it either. I think, we have to start behaving smartly, intelligently, and responsibly, and acting with consideration that there's people that come after us. It's not all about us. It's not all our narcissism and self-love. And, how do you justify impoverishing your grandchildren so that you can, have an upgrade on your car? Like, it makes no sense. Or
not have potholes. Right.
Yeah. That makes no sense to me.
No, that's great. I think we'll wrap this one up here, and next week what we'll do is we will spend some time talking. We're going to talk about our hedge fund, but talk about hedge funds in general. Talk about some of the moves that are being made by governments here as they're making moves toward digital currencies. What that means, there's a lot of fear around that. Some of it valid, some of it not. So we want to hit that, and then talk about hedge funds, what they do, what role they play, who they play that role for as well, and then we'll talk a little about what our fund's doing too. So I hope you tune in next week. Hope this is valuable to you. We don't need to panic and go only stock up on ammunition, but we do need to start figuring out what it looks like to be responsible, which, Tom, to your point,
totally agree,
is bringing God back into this equation here, because we've been acting like he doesn't exist in our finances or in our government. So, Tom, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you again for listening to Wealth Well Done. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player, and together we'll continue to improve our relationship with money and our effectiveness in stewarding it well.